Good evening and welcome to the forum. I'm John Matisonn. My guest tonight is Jakkie Cilliers. Jakkie is a futurist. He's the founder and chairperson of the Institute for Security Studies. He's traveled all over Africa many, many times. And Jakkie, I'm delighted to welcome you. You talk in your new book, Africa First, about exactly what we think should be everybody's task in South Africa. How do we create jobs and growth?
John, yes, thanks for having me on the show. And yes, I think that is what concerns all of us, not only in South Africa, but across the continent. And I've traveled extensively. I tell you, the first bit of good news that I have is that everywhere you travel, people think that they're in the worst spot possible. So when you come back to South Africa, you realize probably we're not doing as badly as we actually think we are.
Yes. Now, I want to talk tonight about some of the countries in Africa. I think South Africans we know too little about the continent, both its successes and its challenges or failures. Ethiopia and Rwanda are particularly interesting to me. Let's start with Ethiopia. I see in your book you love Addis Ababa, and I recognize some of your descriptions of the Hilton Hotel there and so on. What has Ethiopia got right?
Okay, so the most important thing to understand about Ethiopia is that it's a country that emerged from what is known as the Red Genocide after the Mengistu regime was ousted. So you had a leadership in Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi that really decided never again. And that trauma of Ethiopia, it's the same in Rwanda, I should add, that trauma shaped a governing elite that was really committed to growth and to development, and nothing gets in the way of that. So that is almost the prerequisite for development globally, and that is to have a governing elite that is committed to growth and development, not a governing elite that is committed to self-enrichment or an elite that is committed to, in actual fact, the institutional setting, whether you're a democracy or an autocracy, matters very little. It is also the story of China, the story of many of your Asian tigers, and that is that a country often that has gone through this kind of trauma, at the other side go forward with a leadership that is committed to never the same again. And that, in short, is the history of Ethiopia, particularly under Meles Zenawi. Of course, they're going through very difficult times at the moment, but that really is the critical issue.
Before we get to the specifics, we had JP Landman, the economist, on the show last week, and he made the point that it's not so much about throwing money at things, it's about structural change to the economy. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, for example, Ethiopia is a low-income country. It's coming from a very, very low base, yes. But it has, in the last 2-3 decades, it's been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And they've done that through a commitment towards low levels of corruption, institutionalization, and a commitment that everything they do is aimed at levering the maximum human capital and technology out of their system. And the results are there to see. The times that I've been to Addis are, I've been there 50 times. And when I used to go to Addis 20, 30 years ago, you never saw an Ethiopian that was overweight. Today, when you go there, the body shape of Ethiopians have changed. it's just a reflection of one of the most remarkable transitions that we have seen globally in a country that Bono and others were categorizing as starvation prone and really at extremely low levels of development. And it's come with considerable pain, I should add.
Before we go to the specifics, it's done it with very minimal resources. It didn't have lots of oil or gold or coal or any of those things, did it?
Yes, that's one of the best resource that countries can have, whether you're speaking about South Korea or China. It's people. And if you invest in its people, in its human capital, you change a country. And that's what Ethiopia is doing. Those countries, Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, or Equatorial Guinea, that have the benefits of large natural resources, end up with what we refer to as a resource curse. And this is where large streams of money end up going into the pockets of consultants and a small elite. And this is what's going to happen in Mozambique, I'm afraid to say. A few years ago, we did quite a large study just at the start of the gas finds. And there is nothing that the gas finds in northern Mozambique is going to do about poverty in that country, or indeed that the Grand Inga scheme in the DR Congo is going to do about for ordinary Congolese. People think there is a kind of a shortcut to development, and African leaders love this. They think that they can jump into industrialization, like following the example of the former USSR. If there's one story that my book tells, it is the story that there is no shortcut. We need to invest in the basics. And those basics are getting up your demographic dividend, investing in education, in water, sanitation, then entering low-end manufacturing. And that is the story of successful developmental states throughout the world. It is not finding a gas find or an oil find or gold and using that. In actual fact, very few countries, Australia and Canada are two of the examples, Botswana would be one in Africa, have used their mineral resources to invest in growth. South Africa did that to a degree with our gold, but of course that was in an apartheid system where our gold and mineral resources were used to benefit a very small elite and not trickle down into the rest of the continent. So investing in your human capacity, as the South Koreans would say, is what it's all about.
Okay, I would like to ask you specifically, what sectors did the Ethiopian authorities push, and what are the benefits? I know you mentioned manufacturing, for instance, and we know that South Africa has prematurely deindustrialized. We've reduced our manufacturing, and that's happened in a lot of countries, and manufacturing is critical to growth. What did Ethiopia do there, and what else did they do?
So Ethiopia is a low-income country. It's a poverty-stricken country. And typically, low-income countries, you go up the agricultural growth path.
Right.
You first invest in agriculture. You feed your people, make sure that they have enough calories, not to export, but to first make sure that your human capital endowment is well fed. And then you go up the literacy levels, education, and so on. And Ethiopia has done that. And then the other thing that it is invested in is it invested in the development of the basic infrastructure. By basic infrastructure, in this instance, I mean road and rail and this kind of stuff, and education and health systems. I should say that the Ethiopian development in health systems is in actual fact largely donor funded, ironically, mostly by US aid. I say ironically because there's all kinds of challenges and issues that we can speak about later. Right. But so they are taking a basic approach where they are trying to invest in agriculture, in education, and in health, the basic foundations of growth. And these are hugely problematic. It's a country that has got dozens of ethnic groups and different languages, and simply getting Amharic, for example, as the lingua franca in Ethiopia is a huge challenge. So these countries struggle for development, but they get to development by having a leadership that is committed to delivering growth, not a leadership that is committed to investing in their own pockets. And that is the difference between Ethiopia and Rwanda, and a number of other African, Botswana would be another example, where you have really a leadership that commits to the investment in people and the betterment of the country.
Before we move on from Ethiopia, can you just be specific? So agriculture has grown significantly, And what else? And low-end manufacturing, are these real drivers of growth there?
Yes. Ethiopia has, for example, in the southern parts, invested in a number of large special economic zones, which we would know very much from South Africa, where they are going in the horticulture and the agricultural business to sort of use that as a stepping stone to go up into manufacturing. As you know, when you look to the future, agriculture is in actual fact becoming like manufacturing. You run a farm like you run a factory. So on the agricultural and low industry sector, that's what Ethiopia is doing. They're enticing Chinese and other investors in, creating a stable investment climate and providing, increasing the rule of law and stability as a basis for attracting foreign direct investment and getting Ethiopians to invest in Ethiopia. We all know about the Grand Renaissance Dam that the Ethiopians have built to the great horror of the Egyptians. What is not well known is the extent to which Ethiopian diaspora and invested in bonds to invest in that dam. So capitalizing on Ethiopian diaspora and Ethiopians in the country have in actual fact also benefited Ethiopia in making it possible to go up that manufacturing and industrialization ladder, starting at a very, very low level.
Before we need to go to a break, just to finish on Ethiopia, the consequences are already there to see. The growth rate has been something like 10%. What has this done for the ordinary people? Has it really brought people out of poverty? What are the stats on that?
Ethiopia's human development indicators have improved dramatically, but it's a country that comes off a very low base. So it really has a long road to travel, and even by South African standards, we're an upper middle income country. Ethiopia is a low income country. There is really a long road ahead. Development takes time. So I think that the problem that the country faces is that it has quite what we refer to as a democratic deficit. It is much less democratic than you would expect countries at similar levels of development. And the process of democratization is fraught. And we see the challenges that Prime Minister Abiy is facing at the moment, because they've tried to create to transform an ethnic federation, which is unique in the world, into a single country, which is what he's trying to do. And that unleashes all kinds of nationalist and ethnic challenges, because this is not 20 years ago where you can develop and then democratize. The international community, particularly the West, insists on democratization and development in parallel. And this is a bigger challenge than was faced by China and the Asian tigers, who all followed a trajectory of first development and then possibly later democratizing. These are big ticket issues that Africa faces.
We're going to go to a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Rwanda and the lessons for South Africa. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Jakkie Cilliers, whose new book is Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. Jakkie, I want to move on to Rwanda, because Rwanda, we hear a lot about it, but it's not very coherent. I don't really understand what they've done right, because you're arguing, I think, that they've also done things right and they've really brought growth.
Yes, Rwanda sees itself as a sort of a technology and industrial hub, but particularly around information communication technology in the Great Lakes region. Again, what you have is a leadership, an authoritarian leadership, that is committed to the rule of law, to low levels of corruption, and to trying to make Rwanda a safe and an attractive investment destination. And again, if you look at the developmental indicators in Rwanda, it's quite a remarkable success story. It's a country that, again, comes off a very, very low base. But what you find is that they have a vision and they implement the vision. They stick to it. And Paul Kagame lets nothing stand in his way when it comes to implementing that vision. It comes with challenges around democracy, human rights. But if you ask the ordinary Rwandese about the situation in their country, given their genocidal, the background of a genocide, then I think that the situation in Rwanda reflects this critical issue of a leadership that is really committed to growth and development.
And you made the point earlier that it doesn't require authoritarianism. Democratic governments have been able to succeed as well.
Yes, they have, but it's much more difficult. Democracy is largely correlates with levels of development. So very often your wealthy countries are democratic and your poor countries are undemocratic. And when you look at levels of democracy in Africa, Africa is in actual fact, given its level of development, quite democratic. But we often find that countries try to democratize at quite low levels of development, and this leads to high levels of corruption. South Africa and Kenya are two examples of countries that are considerably more democratic than you would expect given our levels of development, and it translates into all kinds of other problems. If you don't democratize, of course, then you end up with the potential of an explosion. So finding that balance between the level of democracy and your level of development and managing that in tandem that's the art of politics.
But coming back to Rwanda specifically, what sectors have they grown? And I mean, they've had good growth rates for some time. Has that also shown in the Human Development Index? Are they rising?
Yes, if you look at indicators of extreme poverty, which is people living below $1.90, levels of female mortality, maternal mortality, levels of infant mortality, these are the traditional measures that you use to look at where a country is headed. And Rwanda is doing exceptionally well on all these indicators. You see foreign investors looking at the country, and it is using technology to try and leapfrog some of Africa's developmental challenges. And technology is going to be one of our saviors in Africa, because modern technology allows you to, for example, roll out electricity in rural areas using wind and solar and decentralized off-grid systems much more rapidly than was the case in the past. So Rwanda is using these to leapfrog into the future. So you can give every Rwandese an access to a bank account. You can give them access to an identity system and to a postal or a postage delivery system by using the internet. And these advantages, I think, are some of the things that Rwanda has really been quite extraordinarily successful on. It's the only country that started with the delivery of essential materials to to hospitals using drones some years ago. Everybody else is now catching up.
Right. And what other specific sectors are growing in Rwanda?
I think the most important that Rwanda has seized upon is establishing itself as the information and communications technology hub of its region. It's a small country with limited natural resources, but it is quite centrally located, and seeing itself as an ICT hub, as an innovation hub, is one of the innovations that I think Paul Kagame has seized upon to change the entire thinking of Rwanda into entrepreneurialism, into development, into what I find is so critical, and that is that development is an actual fact about making people independent of the state, empowering them. While what we're doing in South Africa is exactly the reverse. We make people dependent, and that eventually does not pay off.
And I mean, that is extraordinary for a poor country to use the information economy as a growth mechanism. And we in South Africa, we haven't done that as efficiently as we should have.
No, we have the potential. We have a vibrant private sector. We have high technology, but we just don't seem to get our act together when it comes to being able to implement our grandiose schemes into reality. And we are often our own worst enemy. In South Africa, government policies often serve as like a wet blanket on development. I mean, we face huge problems. Some of it from many of them originate in apartheid, but they've been exacerbated by the ruling African National Congress. If, for example, we carry on with our system of providing social grants, 18 million South Africans are on social grants, without trying to create a entrepreneurial class, we are not going to move forward. Our Black economic empowerment is all aimed not at supporting success, supporting taxis and spaza shops. It's all aimed at creating big, rich Black businessmen, all of them men, I should add. And that is not the way to grow a country. You grow a country by getting behind success, behind the small man or woman, and empowering them.
Just before we leave Rwanda, I mean, I noted with interest that Rwandan investment started the first South African mobile telephone company manufacturer in outside Durban, in the special economic zone north of Durban. And that's extraordinary that Rwanda, poor country like that, is sort of teaching us to suck eggs.
Yeah, and you do that by making yourself open for foreign direct investment, not trying to place all kinds of requirements on foreign direct investors, but inviting skilled foreigners with cash to come in. In South Africa, we try and make it as difficult as possible, particularly of skilled foreign investors. We should be welcoming them. When China clamps down on Hong Kong, we should be going to the people of Hong Kong and say, come to South Africa with your money, with your skills. But we just don't do that. We just seem to be fast asleep and busy empowering cadres instead of empowering the ordinary man and woman on the street.
Before we run out of time in this segment, I want to talk to you about China, because I found your references to China in Africa extremely interesting, and some of them were different from what I might have expected. You say that the Chinese are responsible for a great deal of increased manufacture in South Africa, in Africa, throughout the continent, that they often use African workers, because there was a criticism that they use mainly Chinese workers. But you also say that we should be learning from China about how to use foreign manufacturers coming into South Africa. Could you just unpack all of that for us?
Yeah, so what China has done is, through the last 20, 30 years, it has used foreign companies to invest in China, to learn from them, and then to indigenize and build from them. And that's exactly what South Africa should be doing. We should be inviting foreign companies to invest, establish local supply chains, and indigenize based on that. Now, we have done that in the past. The biggest success in South Africa, of course, is around our motor manufacturing and assembly plants, but we can be doing much more. But you must instrumentalize foreign direct investment in foreign companies to your own benefit, so that you get the technology and the capital transfer, so that it's not only that they come and exploit, which is often what happens in Africa, but that technology transfer is what China has taught the rest of the world. They are past masters at it. And that's what we should be doing in South Africa.
We, before we run out of time, I mean, it's interesting to me. On the show, I've talked to a number of people, South Africans in the ANC and so on, who've gone to China. You know, they do training in China. And I asked Secy and Becky about this, and I said, you know, I asked one of my guests what they teach us in China. And what he said is they generally teach us how the Chinese system is more democratic than we think. Well, it's not a debate I need to get into here. But I said, well, why don't we go there and teach them about our constitutionalism and our democracy and learn from them about their economic development? And then Secy and Becky's response to that was, well, the Chinese will do what you ask. We aren't asking. We should be insisting that the Chinese give us those kind of benefits, and we use them to learn from their economic policies, rather than you know, getting stuck in a sort of a fraternal political alliance.
Yes, I mean the many African leaders, including the ANC, look with longing eyes at the authoritarian top-down political model in China and the economic success that has delivered. Now, South Africa and China, you know, very, very different countries. The Chinese system will not work in much of Africa, because partly in Africa you have the democracy genie is out of the bottle, and managing democracy and development is much more difficult. China doesn't have that charge. The Chinese Communist Party can decide what they would want to do economically and enforce that through the Communist Party. That is just not an option that is available to Africa. So large portions of the Chinese model is not
Yes.
it's not possible to implement that in Africa. So I think what we need to do is look at the issues around technology transfer and the commitment to growth. Nothing is more important than economic growth. And what we have in South Africa is we have a governing party that's largely orientated towards redistribution, not towards growth. We need to redistribute, but you first need to grow.
We need to stop there. Our conversation with Jakkie Cilliers will continue in a week's time, but meanwhile we're going to a break, and when we come back we'll be talking about the US elections now that they're over. The drama hasn't ended yet. We'll be right back. And welcome back. We're talking now about the US presidential election, now that it's over, with Millard Arnold, former US Special Representative in South Africa and producer of a number of books on Steve Biko, and Professor John Stremlau of the University of Witwatersrand, also a former senior US State Department official. Before we get to President Trump's refusal to accept the results, Millard, how did you react to the election of President-elect Joe Biden?
Well, needless to say, I was elated that he was, that the American public thought that he was a much better choice for the country that they feel so strongly about. We had the largest turnout and John will correct me, but certainly I think since in 100 years or thereabouts. And, the American public chose a man of decency and integrity to lead them into the future. And I was very pleased by that.
And you had told us that black turnout would be important, and that the work of people like Stacey Abrams in Georgia and others to build black turnout for Biden and of course Kamala Harris as vice president-elect would be an important factor, and it was, Millard.
Well, I think so. I mean, again, if we just take the state of Pennsylvania, in 2016, Trump won that by 44,000 votes. And in the city of Philadelphia alone, 230,000 blacks did not vote. That alone would have changed the election in 2016. This time around, the turnout has been tremendous. And as a consequence, those votes that didn't show up in 2016 did show up in Biden's camp this time around. And I think it made a difference. And that's been repeated in states like Michigan, which Trump won by, I think it was 11,000 votes in 2016. And some 277,000 blacks did not vote in Detroit. So if you go through the states that mattered, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, Georgia, all of those, you will see that the turnout of blacks in 2016 was not as great as it was in 2012, and far greater than in 2016 this time around. So yes, it made a huge difference.
John, on a previous program, you said Donald Trump was an embarrassment to you as an American. Then this weekend, with the infection rate, COVID-19 infection rate soaring beyond anything before anything else in the world, and the results coming out, President Trump spent 2 days on the golf course. So I assume you share Millard's relief that he's been defeated.
Well, of course, I share Millard's view on that, John, but also it's important to bear in mind, and I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic, that despite the pandemic and despite the complexities, you had this outpouring of voter support that was heartwarming, and even if the sum totals were a shock to me because Donald Trump got over 70 million votes, not enough to catch Joe Biden, who won the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. But when the proportion of the votes was as high as it is this time, it was, as Millard suggested, in 1900. In 1900, women didn't have the vote and African Americans didn't have the vote. So if it wasn't for the 19th Amendment in 1920, and it wasn't for the civil rights laws of 1965, we wouldn't have the kind of outcome that we had.
Right.
However, the Democratic Party, I think, has not won a majority of white votes since 1965. And so what you're seeing is a transformation of the United States. And what Biden and Harris symbolize is a more inclusive, more diverse America. And what Donald Trump's right-wing populism represents is a marriage between plutocrats and those who are fearful of their loss of status from the more rural states, the less educated states. I mean, it really was a question of diversity and diplomas, with the urban areas really pouring out for Biden and Harris and actually carrying the day, but also the urban areas across the rest of the country, even in the old Rust Belt in the Midwest. And so it's a profound moment in American political history.
Right. John, you also were suggesting when we talked earlier, before the election, that the Republicans, like that group, the Lincoln Project, would have marginal effect or no effect. And that seems to have been proved too. The Republicans did not defect. It was a high turnout on the Biden side and a high, slightly less, but also a high turnout on the Trump side.
Well, it was, John, and we're missing the elephant in the room, which the founding fathers, in fairness, had some concern about, as did the founding fathers of a much more enlightened constitution here in South Africa. Namely, expertise and elite opinion causes a backlash when times are tough for the rank and file, and therefore they become, the rank and file, vulnerable to quick, easy, emotionally satisfying answers by demagogues. And that's what you saw in Donald Trump. And the founding fathers thought they had prevented the rise of a demagogue by their checks and balances system, but it's an antiquated system. It was done in 1789 when the founders here, O.R. Tambo and Qatar Asmal and others put together this constitution. They wanted to protect us from ourselves by putting in Chapter 9 institutions and putting in a much more inclusive framework for a human rights-based constitution than the American states' rights-based constitution. So they're different, but I think both authors of their constitution saw the problem of demagoguery and populism, but in the US it's of a right-wing variety like you see in Europe.
Millard, last time you were a voice of reason while people were worried that Trump wouldn't accept a peaceful transfer of power. Now he's refused to concede defeat or make the traditional phone call or invite the winner to the White House, and he's changing staff at the Pentagon. Are you still calmly confident he'll go on January the 20th?
Well, I think the process is fraught with an enormous amount of danger in the days, weeks, and months ahead. The Constitution allows for 35 days for any dispute regarding the election process that has taken place. That process ends on December 8th. The Electoral College is supposed to vote out or certify its findings on December 14th. If there is going to be a legal challenge, particularly one that goes to the Supreme Court, in theory, it has to be resolved before December 8th or certainly before December 14th. I don't think that's likely to happen, which then opens the possibility of there being uncertainty going into January 6th, when the results are supposed to be declared by the joint sitting of the Congress. If that happens, what I'm concerned about, there's Electoral Count Act, which was established in 1887, in which the electoral votes are read in the Senate on January 6th. There is that possibility, the way that the act is read, that if any one senator and any one member of the House of Representatives were to object to the reading of a finding by one of the electors of a state, that issue could throw it into the House, into the Congress for resolution. So there are large numbers of potential pitfalls, legal pitfalls, that are still available to frustrate the transition of power to Joe Biden. In the end, however, I think Biden will prevail, but it will not be without some discomfort and without some unpleasantness in, again, the days, months, and weeks ahead.
John, do you take the same view, before we go to the break, that there is this danger of this congressional interference, but that likely all will be well?
No, I agree that it likely will be more than well. He will be inaugurated, Biden-Harris, on the 20th of January. What we've seen so far is the legal challenges have proven baseless. There is been such conscientiousness on the part of the electoral authorities in all of the 50 states so far that nothing has stuck. I'm more concerned, frankly, with the running out of funding for the federal government on December 14th, and whether or not they can actually take actions that would be remedial for the impact of COVID and the budget crisis between now and then. And I'm also concerned about Donald Trump screwing up the workings of government by his firing people like the Secretary of Defense Esper yesterday. And they're just a chaos. But I don't think on the legal front that we have really much of a problem. I think this is now set in stone. Biden and Harris will be elected.
John, we have just about 60 seconds, but these allegations of fraud, I mean, I don't believe them, but a lot of people still seem to be going into the social media and finding allegations, seeing videos and so on. You don't see any reality to them.
No, I don't so far, John, and I think that it is heartening to see the hard work of the electoral management bodies in all 50 states. It's a complicated system. It is vulnerable, but by and large, it's held, and there have been no serious allegations of fraud that have been proven or even pursued.
Yeah. Millard, the other thing we don't have time to talk about this properly, but we were expecting a Biden victory. There has been a Biden-Harris victory, but the polls were wrong. We expected the Democrats to do better in the Senate, better in the House, and better in the states. I think I'm going to hold this and ask you to give us a response when we come back. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Millard Arnold and Professor John Stremlau about the US elections. Millard, the polls were wrong. The Democrats won the White House, but they failed elsewhere. Of course, this has implications for the redistricting of the Congress for the next 10 years. And it also has implications in the Senate, where it looks, depending what happens on January the 5th, when two Georgia races, or the runoffs happen for two Senate seats. If those two go to the Democrats, then Biden will have a wafer thin majority in the Senate. If not, he'll have to govern with the Republican Senate. We overestimated the backlash against Trump, didn't we?
I wouldn't say that. I think the backlash against Trump has been revealed in the votes that have taken place. Biden wins by almost 5 million voters in America who felt that it was a repudiation of all that Trump had stood for, and particularly his handling of the pandemic. And I think it's even more interesting when you look at on the same ballot that Trump finds his name on, there were senators from the different parties, and Republicans made a conscious choice to vote for those senators, but not for the president. So this was a rejection of Donald Trump. And it is I think, a hallmark of the sophistication of the American public in looking at an election like the one that we've just seen. The Republicans actually gained seats in the House, and it seems like may be able to hold the Senate. But at the same time, they repudiated Donald Trump. And I think that's a reflection of how America has looked at this election. This has been a referendum on Donald Trump and his leadership. And the American public has said, enough is enough, you have to go.
Okay, so looking ahead, we now have Biden has been moving fast, John. He's really got things going. He seems to have an agenda. He seems to know exactly what he's doing. I mean, I think we discussed this before, that his age has affected him in terms of his articulation a little bit, but his strategic sense has been very good during this campaign. His judgments have been sound, and he's moving forward. He knows what he wants to do. He's got an aggressive agenda. What's your impression of Biden so far? And do you think he can get he can do deals? If he doesn't have the majority in the Senate, can he and Republican leader Mitch McConnell work together?
Well, he can certainly do an awful lot, even if they can't work together. He has had deep ties to the people in the Congress for all of his 50 years in government service, or almost 50 years in government service. It is a fresh breath, but there is this question of the reckoning and the wreckage that Donald Trump will leave behind, both in his lying and in his disruption of the due process and his attack on the rule of law, as well as basic constitutional provisions. And whether that reckoning and the corruption that seems to be endemic to this administration will be held. There's been some talk in the US press about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, others saying, no, what we really ought to do is to get down to the hard work of getting some progress made on COVID and on the climate change and the environment, while strengthening the discourse. One of the things that is, you referred to, John, is social media. Tweeting is to serious conversation what polling is to voting. I sometimes think you got to be serious about both voting and conversation. And that's been lacking in the overheated atmosphere. The debates were symptomatic of that. And Trump is really the extreme example of a breakdown in civil discourse. So Biden and Harris have their work cut out for them. And I think that we'll see if they get progress on COVID, and they get progress on economic recovery, and they get some progress on racial reconciliation. And they certainly have plans to do that. Their plan that we should be watching here is the very brief statement, the Biden-Harris agenda for the African diaspora, which does have references to both those African first generations in the United States, but also the need for an Africa policy that is very real. So there's an opportunity here for cooperation, and I hope that will be pursued by South Africa.
Right. Millard, where do you see American politics over the next few years? I suppose it's very difficult, really. I mean, I assume Biden is a one-term president. I assume in 2 years' time there'll be elections. I think the Senate numbers could favor the Democrats, but tradition holds that the White House party can lose seats in 2 years' time. What kind of 4 years do you see ahead of us?
Well, frankly, going back to a question you raised earlier regarding the turnout that Trump experienced in this election, one of the notions that some have is that the vote was as much a vote against, the vote for Trump was as much a vote against Kamala Harris as it was anything else. There is a concern that because of Biden's age and because he may well be a one-term president, that in effect voting for Biden, the Biden-Harris ticket was to be in effect voting for a future US president who would be Kamala Harris. And for those who felt that they didn't want to see that happen, they basically held their nose and voted Trump. And when you look at the fact that, according to the statistics I've seen, 3 out of 5 white Americans voted for Trump, we're looking at a polarization, and the point John made earlier on, which is that Trump has been the choice of white America Biden and Harris represents the choice of a more diversified America. And that diversification will be the future of America moving forward. I don't think there's any doubt about that. This was perhaps the last real gasp of those who wanted to believe in a notion of identity politics, of a notion of white supremacy, of a notion that somehow or another people of color and women were not to be the people who run America's democracy. So what do I see looking forward? I think there's going to be a very polarized electorate ahead of us. One of the things I think that the Democrats have not cottoned on to is that there is a perception on the part of Republicans and many on the right that Democrats are weak. And so they will challenge, and the idea, and this is one of my concerns about Biden's presidency, and I believe in him in terms of his approach toward reconciliation, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that's going to buy favor with the right. They are not interested in reconciliation. They're not interested in a hand that's being reached out to them. It's going to take a long period of time before that breaks down. Biden is the right person to do that, but that's not going to happen immediately. And it is a reflection, I think, of the polarization and distrust that exists in America at the moment.
Yeah, now, I mean, and one tries to discern what Trump's plan is. He's raising funds at the moment, claiming therefore for his legal cases against alleged fraud. But in fact, the fine print shows that most of it will go to pay off his campaign debts and other things. So he's going to be a figure around making a noise for some time to come. Millard.
Yeah, no, he will be, but he's going to have his own challenges as well. One of the implications of his losing this election is that all of the various numerous legal actions that have been pending against him and that have not been pursued because he was a sitting president will now, almost from January 21, become live and issues to which he's going to have to combat and face. The number of lawsuits, both federal and statewide, are such that he's going to spend the next number of years battling against legal actions that he's confronted with. So he may play a role, and my guess is he'll use that as a basis for being able to argue that again, that things are being rigged against him. But he is going to have a very unpleasant 2 or 3 years ahead of him fighting off legal actions.
John, I want to end with you. We're almost out of time, but there was something very interesting that Biden said that made me think of you. Biden wants to hold a summit of world democracies to discuss the crisis of democracies, and I think it reflects the problems of America, and really, you and I have talked about how they relate to South Africa and Zuma as well, corruption, campaign finance issues, and so on. Have you thought about that at all? Is that something that could be productive?
Absolutely, and I think it's sooner rather than later, but I would like to see a first step of a serious conversation between Cyril Ramaphosa and Joe Biden, because Millard is absolutely right. Race defines both of our countries. The legacy of white supremacy in this country is by a minority that has now been put to bed, even though the ANC is deeply, deeply divided about how to move forward as a national party. And speaking as a member, and I would like to see that reconciled, whereas in the United States, you have the polarization between the two parties, but you have the prospect of a Biden leadership born of the experience in the Obama White House, where he is now aware of the challenges that will be facing him in trying to extend racial reconciliation and national integration and reconciliation, but it's going to be very difficult, as Millard said. And I think Trump's power is ebbing from him. It's rather a question of whether there'll be a Trumpster who will come after him or not, and how do you prevent that?
We just have 30 seconds, but I do want to go to the problem of democracies worldwide and the sort of contest of ideas globally. It does seem that there is a problem in democracies beyond the racial one. I mean, in the UK, in Europe, in many parts of the world, in Brazil, in India. And do you see anything coming out? You know, isn't that what Biden is also looking at?
It's tribalism, John, by various means. South Africa has come to terms with that in the Freedom Charter and in its constitution. And I think it has a very interesting conversation to have with the United States, because United States federalism is like the aggregation of tribal nations. And so therefore, I think there won't be a right-wing populism here. There has been a populist strain, but it's not been right-wing. It's been very different from the populist strain in the United States or in Europe. And I think that there's constructive dialogue to have between our two democracies, complicated as they are.
Thank you, John. John Stremlau, Professor of International Relations at Wits, and Millard Arnold, a producer of a number of books on Steve Biko, among his many other talents. Thanks so much for doing this. Let's hope that we're at the last legs of this nightmare, and that soon there'll be a democratic settlement in the United States. That's it for now. Good night, and thanks for watching.